Welcome each and every one of you joining us on Zoom and on Facebook Live. At last check, we had more than 700 people registered for this webinar. I think that shows the level of interest that everyone has on the various ongoing stories from Israel and how they affect us here in Canada. I'm really looking forward for us to get into those, from judicial reform, the Saudi-Iran deal, counter-terrorist raids, the talks with the Palestinian Authority, and the list goes on. My name is Gail Adelson-Markovitz, and I'm the chair of the board for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CJA. It has become clear that our community has both interest and concern about the new government in Israel, the coalition led by Netanyahu, and its implications for civil status, the judiciary, security in the region, and even the very future of our democratic project in Israel. While it is the citizens of Israel who elect their government, that choice has ramifications for many aspects of our partnership that specifically impact diaspora Jews. We feel that our interests must, at the very least, be heard, if not respected, particularly in those areas where we are impacted. Of course, we must be ever mindful that our legitimate criticism may become fodder for our adversaries and will be used against us to further delegitimize the state. That's why I personally particularly love the themes of these town halls: unity, not uniformity. We will not necessarily agree on everything or share the same opinions, but we must remain united to ensure that the absolute right of the existence of a democratic Jewish state in Israel is never questioned. And one of the things that CJA is working on to help our community engage constructively is a resource page on our website that includes information on where you can find the latest news about what's happening in Israel, along with topical pieces on what's driving the headlines. More importantly, though, we're developing a user-friendly way for Canadian Jews to connect directly to Israeli political leadership, to share their concerns, offer comments, or just share your views. So stay tuned, and for those editions which will be coming out in the weeks ahead. With that said, we're very fortunate to have an incredible panel here today, and moderating that panel is Ellin Bessner. Ellin is a journalist from the Canadian Jewish News and hosts the podcast, the CJN Daily, where she discusses news about Canada's Jewish community. She was born in my hometown of Montreal and graduated with a degree in journalism and political science from Carleton University. Her career as a journalist took her around Canada and around the world, working for CTV News and CBC News, and also stringing for the Globe and Mail, the Canadian Press, and other organizations. She's even interviewed the Dalai Lama and was a business anchor for many years at Report on Business Television, now BNN. Ellin has taught hundreds of budding young journalists in her capacity as a professor at Centennial College Journalism School in Toronto, and before that at Seneca College and Ryerson University. She resides in Richmond Hill, and we are so thrilled to have you here with us today. So Ellin, I'll let you take it over from here.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that intro, Gail. Great to talk to you, great to meet you. And hello, everyone watching on Facebook and on Zoom. I am, of course, the host of the CJN Daily of the Canadian Jewish News, and we have been covering the situation that's been going on in Israel and reaction here at home, of course, and we'll continue to do so. And so today, I'm pleased to be here as CJA invited panelists to discuss the latest developments as it relates to judicial reform. And, you know, we might even have some breaking news as we're on the air, because the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is supposed to be addressing the nation this evening in Israel, so in about an hour or two from now, and also the Defense Minister. But while we wait for the news out of that, and keep your eye on Twitter, and somebody let us know, we're going to also cover a lot of important topics, as you mentioned, some of them, Gail. We are going to take questions from you in the audience via Zoom. So if you've got questions, use the question and answer function on your Zoom chat, and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. We've also had some questions submitted overnight from people who got the emails to sign up earlier in the week, and so we'll try to get to yours as well. Just so you know, if you can't watch this live, it's going to be later on Facebook. So if you can't watch it on live, you can watch it on demand. So I guess that's all the housekeeping items, Gail. And I'd like to now introduce our three panelists. So we'll start off with the Israeli cohort, first with Haviv Rettig Gur. He's a journalist, maybe you've read his stuff, senior political analyst at the Times of Israel. He's written extensively on the current debate surrounding judicial reforms and the elections and security. And he's been out and about today in Tel Aviv on the day of protest. So he's got some stories to tell, I'm sure. Welcome, Haviv. Also joining us from Israel, we have Fleur Hassan-Nahoum. She's Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, in charge of foreign relations, international economic development, and tourism. She's a co-founder of the United Arab Emirates Israel Business Council, which is an association of Emirati and Israeli business and government leaders doing cooperation and trade following the Abraham Accords. She was born in London. She grew up in Gibraltar, where her father was chief minister. She was a lawyer, and then immigrated to Israel in 2001. And she's been on Jerusalem City Council for a decade. In the last Israeli national elections in the fall, she ran as a candidate for the Likud party's primary list unsuccessfully. Meantime, we have from Ottawa, Adam Dodek, an award-winning professor of constitutional law and former dean of the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law. He's written about many, many constitutional issues in Canada, including our notwithstanding clause and how judges are appointed. He also did similar work in Israel. He was a Fulbright scholar there, where he was clerking for the Supreme Court of Israel, so has inside knowledge of how things work over there. And recently, I'm sure you saw it in the news, in February, he was one of the list of esteemed judges and professors of law who signed an open letter to the Israeli government warning about the proposed changes to Israel's judicial system. So hello to Adam and welcome. Thank you all for being here. I'm sure this is going to be an incredibly informative panel. Okay, let's get down to business. So we're going to start off with Haviv first. We're going to ask you just briefly to give us some of your impressions hot off the press as you were out and about in Tel Aviv today, and then a bit of the sort of overall picture of what's at stake and the issues. So I'll give you about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll move on after that. Welcome, Haviv.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me. Ordinarily, I would have a pretty good microphone sitting here and a decent background. I am in the offices of an organization of friends because I am actually stuck in Tel Aviv because the protesters have shut down most of the ways to get out of the city. And so luckily I found a good Wi-Fi connection in time. But that's the story. Today is a day of disruption, as the protesters have called it, and everyone in many of the large cities is feeling it. And so I'm coming to you from this office. And also, as you said, over the course of the next hour, we're going to hear updates that potentially are very, very dramatic. It's not yet clear that that's the case, but that's certainly what's been leaked by people close to Netanyahu, that he's going to announce something dramatic. Possibly, some are saying an end, some kind of a freeze to the judicial reform. The judicial reform is, I'll start at the beginning. This government has suffered for the last about 12 weeks of its existence. From the end of December, has suffered from just terrible chaos on questions of relationship with the US and relationship with Europe. We have a finance minister who wanted to be a very competent and serious finance minister and is a very intelligent man, but his very right-wing politics have sort of come into play again and again and again. And so he has said twice, that he wants to see the village of Hawara, of course, everyone remembers, burned, and that there isn't a Palestinian people, and stood at a podium next to a map of a greater Israel that includes the state of Jordan, causing a crisis with our neighbors, Jordan. Nobody quite understands why that needed to happen, or why he couldn't simply say, I didn't decide on the graphics of the podium when I was in Paris giving a speech. And so we've seen, crisis after crisis. We've seen fights between the police and the police minister, who comes from the furthest right party in the parliament and who has control over the public security ministry. And on just about every issue, to the point that last week, the United Arab Emirates sent an emissary to Netanyahu, an advisor to the leader of the United Arab Emirates, arrived in Jerusalem, met with Netanyahu, and told him that this behavior of this government across, mainly with the Palestinian question, but also with, a lot of these, the breakdown in many ways between Netanyahu and the U.S. government. He has not been invited to meet with Biden, and that's caused a lot of tension between Israel and the United States. All of these things are actually endangering the relationship with the UAE and the Abraham Accords and all the things that Netanyahu wants to advance. And so we're looking at a government that by its own terms, by its own goals, by what it would characterize as its most important priorities, isn't delivering the goods. It is managing the country with just massive amount of chaos. Netanyahu is constantly butting heads with his ministers. And we have a report from today from reporters who are very close to Netanyahu saying that he is going to start seriously cracking down on his ministers, reining them in. He has a political problem doing that. He is a 64-seat coalition in a 120-seat parliament, which means that the smallest member of his coalition, the 5-seat Otzma Yehudit party of Itamar Ben-Gvir, or the police minister, that furthest right party in Israeli politics, if it leaves, it topples his coalition. And so he's a little bit trapped. And all of that chaos and all of that drama and all of that real just profound difficulty functioning is the background to the single greatest source of chaos in Israeli politics right now, which is, of course, the judicial reform, the judicial overhaul that this government is advancing. Over the past 2 months, it's very important to say the Israeli right believes in, I would say, 70 to 80% of this reform. The Israeli Supreme Court is a very powerful court, probably the most powerful court in the Western world. For lawyers in the audience, you know about the issues of standing and justiciability, who can appeal to a court, what issues courts can tackle. The Israeli Supreme Court has ruled on political appointments and cabinet appointments and policy questions and applied reasonableness tests in ways that other courts have not. The Israeli right has for 3 decades had a real and serious argument about judicial activism. But the way this particular reform has advanced, it has advanced in this government, actually really chaos. And chaos, again, by the terms of the government itself, it's astonishing to read right-wing, not just analysts and journalists, but real activists who support this government, who believe in this government, who love this government, who support this reform. And they are looking at how this government has handled this reform. You're trying to push through a dramatic change to the Israeli judiciary without noticing, the leaders of the leaders of the reform itself, the people pushing it, Justice Minister Yariv Levin, member of Knesset Simcha Rotman, who heads the Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee in the Knesset and really decides on the schedule of the legislation. They've been pushing this forward, arguing that this is going to enhance Israeli democracy. But half of the country has been listening not to those 2 people, but in fact to the rest of the coalition. And in the rest of the coalition, we've seen bills proposed. For example, we have a police minister from the Otzma Yehudit party and a member of Knesset from Otzma Yehudit, Almog Cohen, who actually proposed a bill in which he calls for allowing police to conduct searches of homes without a court order, without a warrant. We've had bills to give 20% of all government jobs to Haredim without requiring the same academic standards required by non-Haredim. We have bills increasing subsidies for non-working Haredi men. And to the half of Israel that isn't in the coalition, what probably the single factor that correlates most to whether you voted for the parties in this coalition or whether you voted for parties who are now in the opposition, the single factor that correlates most among Jewish voters, it works a little differently in the Arab community, but among Jewish voters is religiosity. And so in effect, and this is 75% true, not 100% true, but 75% true, that in effect you have a religious coalition and a secular opposition. And that means that the preponderance of the tax base is now sitting in the opposition. And the vast increases in budgets to the parts of the population that don't work, Israel has a very low unemployment level. And so when we say that 50% of Haredi men don't work, that's a cultural choice, that's a religious choice. And the budget increases in the billions, in the tens of billions to those communities because they're now in power, has driven a kind of culture war background, a visceral sort of sense of all or nothing, accompanied by a lot of illiberal statements like burning a Palestinian village or allowing suddenly a bill for search for allowing police to search your house without a warrant. We saw a bill from Shas that makes women at the Western Wall who are dressed immodestly be subject to 6 months prison sentence. Now, that bill was thrown out by Netanyahu, who actually met with Shas members of Knesset and yelled at them for making everything worse and making it seem like, the government was seeking authoritarian and really ruining the right. But there have been dozens of bills like that. And Shas was also very insulted that Netanyahu was angry at them and threw out their legislation because, in fact, that bill that would give a 6-month prison sentence to a woman dressed immodestly at the Western Wall was part of the coalition agreement, the text of the coalition agreement. It's an appendix to that agreement signed in December between Likud and Shas. Long story short, that's a little bit of into the weeds, so that when we come out of the weeds, we suddenly look around and we start to see a pattern. And the pattern is that this is a government that has tried to pass with essentially a kind of bullying tactic. For 12 weeks, they've been advancing at breakneck speed, probably as fast as Israeli legislation, the Israeli legislative process allows, a very, very profound change to the Israeli judiciary. They've been doing it while all of the politics around, all of the culture war politics of the rest of the coalition has essentially convinced Israelis that, convinced half of the country that this was an authoritarian war on them, that this was a religious and authoritarian effort to stay in power, not be kicked out of power. There was a bill proposed by a Likud member of Knesset just a couple of weeks ago. Again, not a bill that's going to advance, but a bill that for half the country that's in the opposition feels like a signal of intent, that anyone who wins an election gets 12 extra seats in the Knesset automatically. If you form a coalition, you automatically get 12 extra seats. In other words, you never have to ask the opposition's permission on anything else ever again. Now, these are pieces of legislation actually proposed by this government. And if you are not predisposed to trusting them because you didn't happen to vote for them, they look like an authoritarian assault. And I don't really, I tend to think very cynically about politicians in Israeli politics. I don't begrudge those who decide to take seriously what the politicians of this government have been saying. And so we have a culture war around the actual legislation that has made the debate about the legislation itself, about the technicalities, not, when hundreds of thousands of Israelis for 10 weeks running keep coming out to protest, they're not doing that about the technicalities of the institutional changes, and maybe there could be this reform, and maybe we can negotiate it in that particular way, and we can change slightly the way the judges are elected or anything like that. It's not about the technicalities. It's about intent. It's about trust. And intent and trust, I think, in a very profound way, have been lost for reasons that have nothing to do with, it's not a partisan thing to say that this government handled itself very poorly. It's now basically what we're hearing from every single right-wing activist that we talk to. Every single half of Likud MKs will tell us when the cameras are off and and they think they're not being recorded, that this has been, profoundly mishandled. And that is the optimistic version of the story. That's the version of the story if you actually trust in their good faith and that they actually wanted to increase democracy and not, in fact, which the opposition believes, tried to advance authoritarianism. The crisis has begun to hurt the country in ways that can't be ignored. High-tech industries, high-tech companies, the Israeli high-tech industry is, we call ourselves the startup nation. That's not a PR gimmick. That the high-tech engineers and the educated part of the high-tech industry is something like 11% of the Israeli workforce. It is the major engine of the Israeli economy. It brings in the billions in foreign investment, and it is also almost entirely at this moment in the opposition. And the people involved in that industry genuinely believe that there is a war on them by this government. And we've seen money start to leave, and we've seen companies start to look around and see if they can maybe rebase themselves elsewhere. And they're talking about, weakening of the judiciary means that your money is less safe, there's less stability, but it is also part of this culture war. We know that there's a lot of money that hasn't come in. We can't measure the damage because a lot of the damage is what actually investments have been delayed. We know that there was a meeting between Intel and the economy ministry on investing billions more in the Israeli economy, and it was just delayed, not because Intel has an opinion on the Israeli judiciary, Intel works well in countries much less democratic than Israel. Intel has an opinion about chaos, and Intel feels that it can't begin to expand its investments in Israel until it knows what the heck happens, how the story ends. And so, long story short, the high-tech industry has begun to really feel a shift of billions and billions of shekels have already left the country. And the thing I think that if Netanyahu announces in the next hour that he is freezing or delaying, or he won't say that he's canceling, but that he's in some significant way delaying the reform in order to have a broader, more serious discussion worthy of of a constitutional moment, then it'll be because of the army. We have seen thousands upon thousands of soldiers sign on to petitions from some of the most elite units, the Air Force, the F-15 pilots in the Air Force, to just grunts, the simplest soldiers like me in the infantry battalions back in the day, or the Armored Corps, at all levels of the army, at all ranks of the army, say that if this passes, they will not serve. It's hard to convey how dramatic that is. In the Israeli ethos and Israeli discourse, reserve duty is one of the most fun and one of the most important and one of the most meaningful things that an Israeli ex-soldier does. And huge numbers of reservists are in fact in the half of the country that's in the opposition. The cities of Israel with the high military service are the secular cities like Kfar Saba and Modi'in, for those who know the country. And so the part of the country that feels under assault is both the part that sends the most soldiers to the military by percentage, and I think also in actual numbers, and also the part that creates the most economic value, that funds the welfare state and all the things that everyone else enjoys, that everyone in the country enjoys.
All right, Haviv, we're going to wrap up that. We're going to wrap it up a little bit.
Okay, so just last sentence. The harm of this reform and the way it was handled is something that it's going to take years to clean up. And has also revealed to us, I think, the dividing lines in this country that are going to be what we talk about for a generation now.
All right. And I do want to add one thing that you mentioned about Intel and the high-tech companies that are starting to maybe not even come, never mind flee. I don't know if any of you found on Instagram the other day, Lior Raz, Doron from Fauda, he was at a conference and he was urging all Israeli artists who know and care and love about democracy to take their cultural work out of Israel and move to countries. And then he said something very ironic. He said, we should move to the United States where they know what democracy is. So I thought that was fine. An interesting talk. We can talk about that later. But as far as one other thing, and I guess I'm going to bring in, your colleague now from the Jerusalem City Council, Fleur, because we're going to wait also to see whether the defense minister speaks today. Apparently he's supposed to be speaking as well. So we'll follow that up. But from the political point of view, from the Likud side, I would like to ask you, you have written about arevut, the concept of Kol Yisrael arevim ze lezeh, all Jews are responsible for each other. You wrote this in 2021 when Hamas and Israel were having hostilities. In one of your newspaper columns said, if I paraphrase correctly, and help me if I'm wrong, the Israeli diaspora, the Jewish diaspora has always helped the state of Israel. And now it was time, after the hostilities ended in 2021, for the Israelis to take stock of what this impact is on our diaspora friends and brothers too, and maybe realize what the impact of what we do. It's time for us to support, right? Did I get it right?
Yeah, I'm sure.
So I want to use that as a lead into what you're going to speak about, which is what you're hearing as sort of the earpiece of all the delegations, right? And the missions and the foreign diaspora Jews who've come, and dignitaries to express their concerns. So please, you have about 12 minutes. And now we'll turn it over to Fleur Hassan-Nahoum.
Thank you so much, Ellen. It's wonderful to be here. And of course, there is a lot of concern about the reforms, but I'm not objective here. I ran, in the Likud primaries, and I have to tell you that one of the reasons why I think I was not successful in winning a realistic slot at the Likud, because I was one of the few people not talking about judicial reforms. But I have to tell you, in the right wing, in the Likud specifically, this was the topic of the primary elections, this is what everybody was running on. And the people who were actually most passionate, had a plan, have been lobbying for this for the last few years, were the people who got the highest slots on the Likud list. So there was no secret here that this was very much in the agenda of the Likud, at least in the primary election, which I was involved in. Yariv Levin was number 2 after Bibi. He got the first spot on the list, as did many people who only spoke about judicial reform. So to me, it was not surprising that one of the first items on the agenda of this new government was judicial reform. And I mean, I agree with Haviv on kind of the net result of what's happened, but what really kind of angers me is the hyperbole around this reform when you actually break it down. Now, I'm a lawyer, and I know we've got here Professor Dodek who can tell you, his perspective, but it seems to me that we're getting so worked up over taking a judiciary which itself gave itself defined the scope of its own power over the last 30 years with nobody saying a peep. And when the restoration of that power to a proportional rate, the way that it is in Canada, the way that it is in the UK, the way that it is anywhere else, has created this exaggerated backlash that I tend to believe that there's more here than the judicial reforms. And I agree with Haviv that it could have been rolled out a lot better. And I'm not even sure the government understood the backlash that it was going to create. I really don't think they did. But ultimately, I believe this backlash is made up of a number of components that together have created this kind of toxic atmosphere right now. I think we can't ignore that there's definitely a chunk of this, maybe even the engine or one of the engines behind this is the crime minister movement that all throughout the last couple of years of Netanyahu's premiership were demonstrating outside the prime minister home in Balfour every single Saturday night in the thousands, and in many occasions with much hooliganism around it. How do I know this? Because as a humble city council members, all the people who live around Rehavia, people with babies and people with old members of the family have been crying to me, before the government was changed and the Bennett-Lapid government came on board. This was a weekly occurrence, not to this proportion, 100% admit that, but it was a weekly occurrence for over a year, if not 2 years. That's one element of this backlash. The second element is what I believe is a very cynical opposition. Why do I say cynical? Because many members of that opposition have been trying to bring about judicial reform, have been talking about judicial reform for many years, including Lapid. His father, in fact, was a big proponent of judicial reform, including Gidon Sar, who, when he tried to say one thing, he tried to say, why don't we have cameras inside the Judicial Selection Committee? He was poo-pooed, ignored, and it was taken off the table. So what we have here is a very genuine backlash, but made up of many different elements that don't involve the pure reason or fear to the judicial reforms, because most people don't even know what the judicial reforms are about, what it is that's been happening over the last 30 years, and how this affects their lives day to day, how a judiciary have given themselves powers that is actually powers of a second chamber of government without being elected.
I'm gonna interrupt for 1 second, if I may, and ask you. I'm gonna leave a little bit of the sort of comparison. That's Adam's speech, and I don't want to take away his topic about the actual difference in the constitutional chambers and the legislative chambers. I would like to know if you could focus a bit on what you're hearing from the diaspora missions as well, and the Jewish communities of the diaspora, since you do a lot of that, and whether that message is getting through. What are you hearing, and what are they saying to you? So maybe we can just veer off a little bit.
More than anything, what I'm getting is concern at what's going on as a result of people not really understanding what's going on. People don't really understand what type of judicial system we had, what the separation of powers looks like in Israel. So I think there's a lot of ignorance and hyperbole pushed together. And I spent the last 2 months trying to calm people down whilst watching the scenes of the complete chaos that's actually going on in the street. And I'm trying to tell people what I've been trying to tell you over the last few minutes, and that is that the issue here is the hysteria rather than the judicial reform. And the hysteria is created from a lot of different elements that have less to do with judicial reform, some of it to do with hatred to Netanyahu, another part to do with the cynicism of politicians who have been years themselves lobbying for judicial reform, and a backlash from the right as a result of 30 years of the judiciary taking and defining the power for itself that the legislature did not give to them, they gave to themselves. So yes, there is concern. Of course, I'm not going to pretend there isn't concern, but I feel that the concern is more as a result of the hysteria on the streets than the actual danger to democracy. I don't believe there's any danger to democracy. I think that a push to make the Supreme Court a more diverse Supreme Court by imposing on it one check that every single Supreme Court in the world has, and that is that the government has a say in the appointment of judges. I think to make it more, I always say to people, the Supreme Court, 15 Supreme Court justices, how many minorities or ethnic diversity do you think there is? Very little, and as a Sephardi woman, when people ask me, well, why do we need these changes? And I say to them, out of the 15 Supreme Court justices, there's one Sephardi and one Arab. They're like, okay. Now we understand that maybe there's a need for change. Now that may not bother most of the people, that are out demonstrating, or most of the diaspora, but when I actually explain it to people, they understand exactly what I'm talking about.
Have you been aware of following at all any of these open letters that, for example, Charles Bronfman and the philanthropists in the North America, or the federations, Eric Fingerhood, and including Canadian, or even some of the J-Space and New Israel Fund numbers that came out in a survey in Canada recently regarding how Canadians feel about this? Are you hearing in Israel any of this? Does it even get into the Israeli ether at all?
Absolutely.
Are they hearing this?
No, it definitely gets into the press here. Certainly the English speaking press talks about it all the time, but I think that people have short memories. And I have to remind people, and I'm not making any excuses for the chaos that's going on. And I agree with Haviv, this could have been rolled up way better, more strategically. But ultimately, let's not have short memories here. We've had a number of very serious, large-scale crises. We had an Oslo Accord that passed with 61 seats, okay? We had a disengagement that saw people crying on the streets. We've had very big, I would say, episodes in the last 20 to 30 years where people have panicked in the same way. So I want us to keep this into context and understand that what we are having right now is a democratic debate. We're not having a choice of the end of democracy and democracy. And of course, having a right-wing government makes people panic even more. I definitely agree with Haviv about some of the craziness going on. But ultimately, this is a democratic debate. And I just want to call for proportionality and a little bit more for people a little bit to inform themselves a little bit more before writing these these very dramatic letters. And if calm is to be called, it should be called on both sides, because in the last few weeks, it's been the opposition that has been as rejectionist as anybody else in this story.
We're going to get into that point in our questions and answers about how best effectively Canadians and diaspora Jews should be or could be if they want to weighing in instead of these, as you said, open letters. So we'll hold that, and we're going to continue that discussion from our audience participation. But I want to thank you for a great opening. And now we're going to move on to Adam Dodek, professor at the University of Ottawa. Adam, you've got a great understanding of the Canadian angle and the Israeli angle, but you also were one of the people who wrote that open letter. So we might as well give you a chance to explain why you did it. With all the with all the Canadian Supreme Court justices retired and legal minds very concerned. Erwin Kotler as well has expressed this. So I'm going to invite you to spend the next 10 minutes or so giving us the comparison about the judicial reforms and why they concern you. Adam?
Sure. So maybe on the one hand, I'm going to sort of step back from some of the things that that Fleur and Haviv talked about, but on the other hand, sort of focus in on one aspect, which is the Canadian part or the Canadian, I don't know, contribution to the debate over the judicial reforms. And I think many of the people who are listening or watching today might be a little bit surprised to realize as Canadians how much Canada is being used both as a model for some of the reforms and as a justification for them as well. And a lot, as Haviv mentioned and Fleur mentioned as well, a lot of people don't know about the details of the judicial reforms, but one of the centerpieces of them is an override, a legislative override, a provision that would allow the Knesset both to preemptively, depending on what the proposal is, to insulate a law from judicial review from the Supreme Court of Israel, or to override a decision of the Supreme Court of Israel. And the inspiration is often referred to as the Canadian override, because the inspiration for that 100% is what we Canadians know more as the notwithstanding clause. It's not, this isn't the first time that it has been, that the Canadian override has been proposed in Israel. When Ayelet Shaked was the Minister of Justice in 2014-15, she had a similar proposal that was opposed and didn't go anywhere. So that's the aspect of the Canadian model. Also mentioned in terms of the appointment of judges, etc. But Canada is also being used by proponents of the reforms as a justification. And, I sort of first learned this from Canada's former ambassador to Israel, Vivian Berkovich, who I know is familiar to many people, to Ellin, to Haviv, and to Fleur. She writes a digital product called The State of Tel Aviv, and she pointed out to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu was on CNN in early February giving an interview to Jake Tapper, and she's got it embedded on her website, in which Prime Minister Netanyahu explains the override, and basically defends it on the basis that Canada has it, and the implication is Canada has it, so don't worry, it must be good. And I think there is an element of, and that's not the only place where Canada is mentioned. Canada is mentioned there are op-eds in the Jerusalem Post. I was in Israel in December and January reading all these op-eds by people that either had no connection to Canada or limited connection to Canada, talking about how, Canada has the override, Canada has these things, and Israel should adopt them, etc. And I don't think there's an element of either misunderstanding at a sort of neutral level, or there's an element of misinformation in the sense that people aren't familiar with the Canadian override, what it is, or the notwithstanding clause. And I don't think there may, depending on, there may be an element of of actual misinformation in the sense of trying to deceive people, if people actually do know about the Canadian override or the notwithstanding clause in Canada. Because I think as many people here know, the notwithstanding clause in Canada is hugely controversial. It was hugely controversial from its inception in 1981, 82, when it was adopted, and it remains hugely controversial today. It has been rarely used. The intention was that it would be rarely used, and when it has been used, it has been controversial. Yesterday, in the course of preparing for today's webinar, I found a Angus Reid survey that was taken in January 2023 of Canadians that said 58% of Canadians are concerned or very concerned about the increased use of the notwithstanding clause in Canada over the last 5 years, most notably in Ontario and Quebec. 55% of Canadians want to see the notwithstanding clause abolished. And 53% of Canadians, according to Angus Reid, think that the use of the notwithstanding clause in Canada is dangerous for national unity. That's opposed to 28% who are not concerned about that. So all of this to say that if the notwithstanding clause is being held up as a model in Israel, it's not such a popular model in Canada. And I don't think that that's acknowledged by the proponents of judicial reform. And I think the clear implication is that, well, Canada has it, Canada's a democracy, Canada's a good country, and therefore it's good for Canada, so it should be good for Israel. And so I think we have skin in this game, whether we like it or not. Our legal institutions, our constitutional history, our politics are being used as part of the debate in Israel. And I think at the very least, it's important to get the history, the law, the experience right. And the most fundamental thing is that the legislative override, the Canadian override, is highly controversial and unpopular in Canada.
So it's like, be careful what you wish for.
Absolutely.
Can I just say that
Yeah,
is
I was gonna say,
one small part of the judicial reforms. The reforms are not about the override clause. The reforms about much more. And in fact, if there were deliberations, which is what the parliamentary process is supposed to be, in my opinion, they would drop that override clause. So we can't have an argument about an override clause, which is one of many different elements of this reform, and talk about the reform like that's all it's about. It's about defining the powers of the judiciary. That is one small thing that is part of it. I know it's the most controversial part of it, but even the think tank that came up with the reforms are saying, we don't need that if the judiciary has properly defined scope of power. And so, let's not focus just on
Fleur?
one very small thing.
Can I just add to that? I hear what you're saying about that think tank. They said even more than that. They said that, in fact, the 61 vote override, the idea that the Supreme Court will make a decision about something being constitutional, or and then the Knesset can literally, with the same number of votes it has in any given coalition, by definition, a government can't exist without the confidence of the Knesset. That Knesset will then be able to just ignore it with a 61 vote. According to that think tank that helped draft this legislation, that was what they call a GOAT, and which is to say something you put in to a negotiation to have an extreme position at the beginning to take out.
A red herring, we call it.
A red herring. I've never seen a red herring, but that's not a defense of the government. That is the opposite of a defense.
That is just saying that Adam has just spent,
I would say even more than that,
talking about an override clause, which is a small thing.
All right, I need to ask
I want to
you guys,
just add to what Adam said,
because
but that's the tragedy. The tragedy here. Okay.
I want to
Sorry.
ask you something about this particular point. I'm going to jump right in because we had I'm going to start now with questions from our audience. So you're talking about literally the first one that we want to bring up to you. So let's give the person a shout out, read their question, and you can continue on with the answer. Okay, so here we go. Thank you all, by the way, for your great opening introductions. We have tons of questions coming in, so let's get to it before everyone has to go back to lunch in Canada. Vivienne, I hope I pronounced your name right, in Vancouver said, should Israel be considering creating a constitution a la Canada or a Bill of Rights a la United, whatever, or are these basic laws basically de facto a constitution? Discuss. And Haviv, I want to ask you to also explain, you wrote recently that the basic laws that Israel has have already been amended 22 times in the last 5 years, which I don't think people are aware of. So I'm going to open it up to the
It's 23 as of last night.
As of last night. Okay, 3. So please, all 3 of you jump in, whoever wants to. I'll give you a couple of minutes each to answer Vivienne from Vancouver.
So I just want to say about the Constitution, but I also want to and about the 61. Look, this reform was introduced on January 4th or 5th, something like that. And what was introduced was this incredibly extreme position. And it was an extreme position that both, it made, for example, basic laws immune to judicial review. The Supreme Court cannot throw out a basic law. That makes so much sense. That strengthens the constitutional argument that basic laws are constitutional, which is the foundation of judicial review as it has expanded and our court has become more powerful. Everyone agrees that basic laws should not be subject to judicial review. There's only one problem. They refuse to also make basic laws hard to change. And so basic laws can be changed by a simple majority. And that means that anything the government wants to pass and make immune to judicial review, it just slaps the words basic law at the top. The override, the 61 override, erases the Supreme Court. And there's layers to this, requiring massive majority and having the basic law be easily changeable and having a full coalition majority, easy coalition majority. And right now we have this very unified coalition on the Judicial Appointments Committee. All the things put together, it isn't any one thing, one tiny specific thing, as Adam exactly said, can be compared to Canada or Finland or New Zealand. Everybody's been having these debates about what other country has which specific thing, but the totality doesn't exist anywhere. And introducing a bill which, according to Kohelet, this policy forum, and according to Fleur, and I agree that is exactly what they did. They tried to stake an extreme position to actually be negotiated down. But you can't, in a complex and very high stakes negotiation, stake out an extreme position for the beginning, because you burn all the trust you have going in, and then the other side won't negotiate with you. They told Israelis, we're taking away your democracy, and by the way, negotiate us down to what we actually want. It was a disaster, and it will continue to be a disaster if they don't understand how this went down so terribly.
Thank you, Haviv. Fleur, Adam?
I think that the fact that for many, many years, when they tried to create some type of elements of reforms, they were met with a complete stonewall from anybody who had anything to do with the judiciary, created this extreme position. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying, I believe this is how it happened. Like I mentioned earlier, Gidon Saar, who is a big proponent of judicial reform for many years, Ayelet Shaked, when they tried to change anything, they were really met by stonewall. So yes, it's in an extreme position to also counterbalance a very hermetically sealed judiciary that refused to look inwards and understand that there were problems with the way that they'd given themselves power over the years. This is, I think, what happened here. But what I think is tragic, look, even last week, the judicial appointments law was softened in some ways. Some people will say no, some people say it wasn't, some people will say it was cosmetic, but there was some movement towards limiting the amount of justices that this particular government could appoint. And again, what is going on the other side? Cancel. We're canceling any type of conversation. And I think that's a big mistake. I'm not saying anybody's got the moral high ground here, but what I'm saying is that when you've also have a situation where the rest of the reforms have now been pushed to the next Knesset. So you have an opportunity why are the opposition, if they really care about democracy, if this really isn't a political tool to bring down this government, why is the opposition not using this moment to say, okay, let's start deliberating. This is the parliamentary process in order to deliberate. And that shows me that there's a lot of cynicism and politicization of the situation from the side of the opposition.
Back to the question, though, from our audience member, should Israel start hammering out building an actual constitution? Or
I think so, absolutely. I definitely think so. Whether we can manage to agree on anything, you know what Jews are like, I'm not sure. But we should definitely take the basic laws and use them. I mean, the real basic laws, and use them as the basis of a constitution. I was at the book launch last week of a fascinating book called The Declaration of Independence, basically analyzing the Declaration of Independence and the meaning and the deliberations that went into that Declaration of Independence. And I said to them, you couldn't have come at a better time. Please translate this in Hebrew and let's use this work along with the body of basic laws that have been done. This is a good, just country. Let's not get confused. Let's use this as the beginning of a conversation for building a constitution. Amen. I hope so.
Adam, did you want to jump in on this?
Sure. First of all, I would say that the idea, let's not deceive ourselves, that a constitution is not a panacea for all ills in any society. And a constitution itself is neither good or bad. There are many, Israel doesn't have a formal constitution. There are other countries, Syria, Russia, China, Hungary, Iran, there's a long list of quite nasty countries that do have a constitution. So a constitution isn't necessarily a solution to Israel's problems or to any country's problems. As Fleur said, there are a lot of things in the basic laws that are already established that probably there's a wide consensus about the basic structures of the state. There's basic law, the president, the basic law, the Knesset, basic law, the government, the controller general, the army, etc. There's a lot of the building blocks there. Typically in a constitution, you see three things. You see parts that set out the structures of the state, right? Israel largely has that in the basic laws that I just mentioned. You see protection of fundamental rights. And you see that in some of the basic laws that Israel has, and you see that in other laws outside the basic laws. I would say that many people see the law of return as a fundamental law in Israel, as a quasi-constitutional law, as something that potentially would be part of a constitution. The third part of a constitution is the part that I think is really critically missing in Israel. And that's the rules of the game. Often what a constitution sets is who can make the fundamental law for the country and under what circumstances, who makes basic laws, how many Knesset members are needed in order to amend a basic law, what is the Supreme Court's relationship to the basic laws. Those are the things that I think Israel needs. And I think that the challenge is we shouldn't expect, if they say Rome wasn't built in a day, if we come back to Canada, for us, we spent more than 50 years trying to patriate our constitution from the United Kingdom. There was a Balfour report, same Lord Balfour, a different report in 1926 that sort of gave the colonies or the dominions the authority to patriate their constitutions, to enact their own constitutions. It took us more than 50 years. It took us 13 tries that failed before Minister Pierre Trudeau succeeded in 1982 to patriate the Constitution with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I think one of the things, if you look at, a constitution can be made in different ways. It can be made through revolution, it can be made after war, etc., or it can be made through consensus. The more consensus you have, the more legitimacy you tend to have. There was opposition to the enactment and the patriation of the Canadian Constitution, certainly in Quebec, but there was broad consensus. 9 of the 10 provinces, the federal government, the leading political parties of the day. And I think the question for Israel is, and for Israeli political leaders, is how do you make a constitution? And what sort of consensus are you looking for in making a constitution? And ultimately, that it's likely to have an impact on its legitimacy in terms of how the public views the constitution.
Can I just jump in? I think one of the
30 seconds, because I'm getting a
30
note
seconds.
in my ear from the producer.
One of the key questions about the Constitution, and this is why I think I agree with Fleur completely, the Israeli center-left, we'll call it, or the opposition, which includes all kinds of different people, one of the concerns with weakening the Israeli Supreme Court is that we have one of the, probably, Adam will know better than me, but one of the simplest systems of government in the world. We have a parliamentary system like Canada's, except the MPs aren't personally elected from regions. And so they are in fact appointed to party lists by their party leaders. And so in fact, the parliament serves at the pleasure of the government. And there isn't really a check and balance because simply the people sitting in government literally put on their party lists the people in parliament for most MKs. And so we have no other real checks. And so when you weaken the court, you leave us completely susceptible to the government. The answer is not to shrink this reform, but to expand it, to give us more checks between government and Knesset. The constitutional idea is so vital to convincing the half of the country that thinks there's a war against it, that there's something that will be left standing when the court is weakened. It's not an accident we have this vastly overpowerful court that no other country has. It comes to fill a real gap. And so if you fill that gap, you can then weaken that court, and that would be a much healthier system.
We have so many questions from the audience. I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I do need to bring up one more thing before we let you all take your opportunity to sum up as we're getting close to the hour mark. And that is, of course, we're in Ramadan. We have to talk about security and violence issues in the Middle East at the moment. Every year, we know what happens around this time. And in the last couple of months, we've seen at least 40 Israelis and maybe 200 or so Palestinians killed in the latest violence, with the reservists protesting, and maybe even the defense minister maybe will resign. We're waiting to see. Anybody on Twitter checking in at the news, let us know. I want to hear what you are worried about or concerned about as we go into the annual violence season, and what should we expect? And I also want to remind people that this is the time when the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis met recently to discuss opening up the access for people to come to Jerusalem during these major holidays, both Palestinians and Israelis. So who wants to start?
I'll just say a few things, Ellen. Look, people don't understand how much access actually. We are not just completely open. Every Friday of Ramadan, we have 100,000 people coming to the Temple Mount, to Haram al-Sharif, as they see it, to pray. We also facilitate from checkpoints coming into Jerusalem, dozens and dozens of buses. You have no idea how much we facilitate the freedom of worship that goes on during Ramadan in the Temple Mount. And anytime the Palestinian leadership use that as an excuse to start a fight, it is a lie, and it is cynical, and it is completely fabricated in order to create a crisis that justifies them attacking us. Now, I don't want to talk too soon, but I'm beginning to feel that the Palestinians are seeing all this chaos in Israel and are saying, you know what, we're going to skip this one this year, because normally by this time, and again, I don't want to speak too soon, but normally by this time, we'd be hearing a lot of rumblings of something. So I'm not sure what's going on, but maybe that's a good thing, that at the moment we're kind of arguing and fighting amongst ourselves and we won't get any outside attacks. I don't know. I pray for peace and calm. And I think the most important thing for our friends and our families, I consider the Jewish people one family, is that we give always the benefit of the doubt. We try and inform ourselves as much as we can, and we try and put what's going on now into a historical context. Jewish people, we have a rich history of arguing amongst ourselves, and let's just keep things in proportion.
Haviv, what are you seeing?
Well, on the Palestinian front, this government, on the one hand, you have a very right-wing branch of this government that has a very particular policy vision for the West Bank, and on the other hand, you have a government that doesn't really want to enact that policy. Netanyahu doesn't want to lose the Abraham Accords and completely sever ties essentially with Biden by, doing what Smotrich and Ben-Gvir would like him to do. And so you have a government that is a little bit stuck, but also posturing in ways that cause damage without actually benefiting from any policy progress. And I say that without commenting on the policy itself. You can love it or hate it, doesn't matter. The government is still stumbling in the dark. Separately, the Palestinian Authority is in full-blown collapse. It doesn't really control most of the West Bank. It doesn't control Shechem. It doesn't control, or Nablus in Arabic, it doesn't control Jenin. And those are places where, because it's essentially collapsed, the Israeli army has to go in almost nightly and operate against various kinds of groups, including Hamas, including new groups that are rising, and Islamic Jihad, which is an Iranian branch, essentially. And so we're headed to, I don't think there's anyone in Israel who thinks otherwise. We're headed to real violence, some talk of even a more serious kind of second round of the second intifada. We're headed into real violence with a government that can't decide what it wants, not even to do, but to signal. It can't even decide. And so that's going to be a problem. I actually want to end with really tremendously optimistic sentiment. Israelis, the latest UN happiness index puts us at the 4th happiest country in the world. And the 4th happiest country in the world is mainly because we rank massively high on social support. Not just social support in the sense of universal health care. Lots of countries have them, although the Scandinavian countries are ahead of us, who have the best kinds of socialized healthcare. But the point is, we have universal healthcare, but also social support in the simple sense of what sociologists call social capital, which is to say big families that support each other, that live close by, something that has really collapsed in the West and led to a massive decline also in birth rates in many Western countries. And we have these big, happy, close-knit families. That's because half of us come from very traditional places, like the Arab and Muslim world. Half of us come, even the ones who are European, are sort of very Eastern European, from Orthodox and Catholic kinds of societies, 3 or 4 generations back. Secular Israelis have more kids than any other developed nation. And just as a sign of optimism, and just as we have so many real strengths, that even as this crisis tears us apart, we still come to the table swinging, and if our enemies, especially Nasrallah, who's given speeches in the last few days, think that this is a sign of weakness, I know a few Israeli friends, especially from my reserve battalion, who think that the best thing that could happen to us is that our enemies test us right now, because it'll give us that relief of being together, shoulder to shoulder, and noticing how much we have together. So Israel is strong. Israel is strong in deep, deep ways that matter. And this crisis is a moment of decision long in coming that maybe we needed.
You wrote that Israel has to face growing up, and growing up is hard. I really like that. President Herzog, I'll give you a sec, Adam, to weigh in, but President Herzog has said that this is a civil war. You, Haviv, have said this is more of a emotional war, not a civil, physical war. And I love that. I love that analogy that you made. Adam, what do you see going forward on the reforms, the judicial reforms of which you are the expert? Is there going to be a compromise? Are they going to have 2 judges appointed per term of the Knesset instead of all of them? Where are we going to see this?
Well, I can't predict the future. I'm not there in Israel. What I would say is I would certainly agree with Fleur that each of the reforms, there is legitimate policy debate around each and every aspect of the reforms. But I would also agree with both Fleur and Haviv that the debate is not a reasoned policy debate on what should the composition be of the committee to appoint judges to the Supreme Court and to other courts in Israel, or how many votes should be needed, etc. That debate, those are legitimate policy debates, though, but there needs to be an atmosphere in which those can occur. And one of the things I was thinking back to what Ambassador Regev said on the last webinar last month, and Ambassador Mark Regev talked about there being a pendulum in democracy, swinging between executive power and judicial power. And Fleur has talked about how over the course of the last 30 years, maybe even 40 years, much more power has been asserted, taken over by the Supreme Court. As Haviv mentioned, there are reasons for that. That was a process that took a long time. Does there need to be, some check on that and some reforms? I would agree with Fleur, absolutely. But I think the challenge is that the pendulum is trying to be swung back, in the course of whether it's a day, a month, a year, and that's a hard thing to do. And that, I signed the letter that came out of U of T with Canadian jurists and law professors because we were concerned about the impact of all of these reforms on the Israeli judiciary, on larger Israeli democracy all at once. And the concern about moving too fast, too far, too broad, etc. But I certainly don't want to leave anyone with the misapprehension that I think everything is grand from a policy level in terms of the structure of the Israeli judiciary, the relationship between the judiciary and the Knesset. But the challenge is really finding the right environment to consider each of those reforms and many other reforms, as Haviv has alluded to, on their own merits. And
we all have to remember, as one of our commentators on our chat with the audience members have said, Andrea Spindle from the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, she said, isn't all this protest leading to more Jew hatred? This is an issue that all of us in the diaspora are petrified of, as we see instances like left, right, and center of swastikas in schools and worse. And so this is all overshadowing all of us in the diaspora as we watch with our hearts in our hands of what's happening in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. I want to thank all three panelists for your insights, for your great discussion. We've learned a lot. I want to thank all the audience members for writing in, and I want to throw it back to Gail of CIJA for a final word. Gail? You're muted, Gail.
Just a really quick thank you, Ellen, to you for wonderfully moderating this panel, and a big thanks to Haviv, Fleur, and Adam for making the time today and offering their insights. And a final thank you to all of you who took the time to participate in this webinar to learn more about the very complicated issues facing the Israeli people at this moment, and to express your passion, your commitment, and your concern. The intensity with which so many of you have engaged in these debates is in many ways a reflection of the primordial importance of Israel to our identity as Jews. And it underscores the necessity now, more than ever before, to remind the Canadian people and the government of Canada that we are united in our shared belief that Israel has the unquestionable right to exist as a democratic state for the Jewish people, that the delegitimization of that state is anti-Semitism, that holding Israel to a standard higher than any other democracy in the world is anti-Semitism. We must all remember to stand together, to come to Ottawa on October 16th and 17th and raise our voices together and push back against anti-Semitism in all of its various forms and disguises. We must face it, we must fight it, and we must ensure that our children can grow up proud, secure, and unapologetically Jewish. Thank you for attending today.
Thank you very much. Gail, maybe you can tell us what's October 16th. We don't know what that is.
That's a conference called Face It, Fight It Against Anti-Semitism in Ottawa, and it's a 2-day conference, and I hope to see all of you there.
All right, and we're going to end off by telling people to, if you have more questions, you want to find out more information, where you can get talking points if you want to argue at work, or you want to explain to people at the Seder tables or your Easter tables or wherever during Ramadan, whoever's watching, all faiths, what's going on. And the answers go to the CIJA website, and they have talking points. You can also, of course, always follow me on the CJN Daily and the CJN's website. That's the cjn.ca, as we are possessed with discussing it as best we can and following the news from Israel. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in, and have a good day.